We have the urinary system, starting with the paired kidneys. Medial to the kidneys, we have this area of the renal pelvis that'll descend down to the paired ureters. Surrounding the kidneys, and we're using a figure here to see the renal fascia. And surrounding that is the pararenal fat. Move on to the urinary bladder, another image we have here. And we see exiting out is the urethra. And this happens to be an image of a male. Inside of the urinary bladder, we have this funnel-shaped area here of the trigone and the layers of muscle. There's actually 3 layers of muscle in the wall, collectively called detrusor muscle. So at the base of the urinary bladder, this valve point an internal urethral sphincter. And now along the urethra itself, the second valve, the more superficial external urethral sphincter. We have this model here, it has 3 segments to it. So starting with this view here, this is what's seen right here. So it's enlarged on this panel. And then this entire piece here is what's seen here. So this is zoomed in on this segment. So we'll start with the large portion. The cortex is the superficial portion of the organ. It's the renal cortex. Whereas the medulla is the sum of all of these pyramids, all of the darker sections collectively are known as the medulla. Extending from the cortex, extending deeper in between those darker sections, it's an area called the renal column. And surrounding the renal columns, the darker portions, these are renal pyramids. And again, collectively, all of these multiple renal pyramids together make the area called medulla. The pyramids point right to the smaller size tube, and this is a minor calyx. And where minors merge together, the bigger tube, that is a major calyx. We can see a number of blood vessels, and we'll just remove the writing. So we have a renal artery and a renal vein. And starting from the red illustrating the renal artery, as it branches, there's now segmental arteries. It branches again, and between pyramids, we can see there, that is a interlobar artery. As it curves around the pyramid, there's now an arcuate artery. And lastly, extending out into the cortex, we have what's called interlobular. So interlobular. Whereas interlobar is within the renal column. Another name for interlobular artery is cortical radiate artery. So now for the veins, the names are paired together. So in blue, there's interlobular vein, an arcuate vein. In the renal column, there's an interlobar vein, and the interlobar vein leads all the way back to renal vein. Segmental artery, segmental is a name just for arteries. So now we need to zoom in closer to here. This is an area known as a renal corpuscle. And going in even closer, and this figure is provided for us. Leading into the glomerulus, the capillary structure, we have, you notice the arrow showing direction going towards it. There's the afferent arteriole, and carrying blood away is the efferent arteriole on each side of the glomerulus. And connected to the afferent arteriole is where we see a cluster of cells known as the JG apparatus. So we have this figure here to use, and we also have this seen on the model. So it's truly the larger size of the arterioles. That's the afferent arteriole with the area of the juxtaglomerular apparatus attached to it, the cells seen here, and the smaller arteriole, the efferent arteriole, both of which lead to this large capillary network of the glomerulus. And we'll go back. So zooming in on this section, that gets us to this panel. And we can see the internal glomerulus here, the capillary structure. And again, taking a closer look at that glomerulus and pulling it out, the cell right on the visceral surface of the capillary, that's known as a podocyte. And the areas that are not covered by the podocyte, these are known as filtration slits. So any of these exposed regions. We have the outer portion of the Bowman's capsule, and one name is Bowman's capsule for this section here. Another name is parietal epithelium. And we'll move to the model. So this can be called the Bowman's capsule or parietal epithelium. So equivalent terms there. Bowman's capsule or parietal epithelium. So that's the outer portion. The internal portion is the glomerulus. And both areas together, Bowman's capsule and glomerulus together, make a renal corpuscle. Well, now extending from the renal corpuscle, we have the various tubules. So we want to go back to this panel here, starting at a renal corpuscle. The first portion of the tube coming directly out, this coiled section, is a proximal convoluted tubule. And now the portion spanning down and back up, all of this section here is where we have a nephron loop. Spanning back out to this area, this coiled tubule is now the distal convoluted tubule. And extending now deeper in, the final segment is known as the collecting duct. So that's the full span of the nephron. And one final term here, we can see the color change from red to blue. This is known as the peritubular capillary network. So now we're moving to the histology of the urinary system, reviewing the kidney, and there's two areas we'll view. Starting here, we're in the area of the cortex, the superficial portion of the kidney, and this is represented by the appearance of renal corpuscles, so these darker sections. And renal corpuscles only appear in the renal cortex in the superficial area. So here we are outside of the organ, and just as we penetrate the surface, we could see multiple renal corpuscles that are located in the cortex. We notice all these other rings here that are present, and this is a cross section through convoluted tubules. And zooming in closer on the cortex, so we once again see a renal corpuscle present, indication that we must be in the cortex. And now we have the various rings. So you have an example like so, whereas an example over here. These are both convoluted tubules. So now we have to look at the internal surface. Looking closely at the internal surface, if you see a kind of a blur, it's the blur of microvilli lining the internal surface. With microvilli present, that's an indication that we're looking at a proximal convoluted tubule right here. Whereas the internal surface really smooth, showing the lack of microvilli, that's the indication we're looking at a distal convoluted tubule. So there's examples scattered around. So now moving to the deeper portion, we're in the renal medulla. And this is an area that lacks any renal corpuscles. And all we notice is just a number of various rings. Some rings have a thicker wall to it, and some rings have a thinner wall to it. And just a closer look. So the rings that have a thicker layer of tissue, that's where we're seeing a collecting duct. And the rings that have a very thin layer of tissue surrounding them, that's the indication that we're looking at a nephron loop.